Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and thanks so much for tuning in. We have a few announcements after our interview about last month's book giveaway and this month's drawing. That's right, we're doing another drawing, so stay tuned for that after the interview. You can get all the details then. On today's episode, we have Dr. Joshua Pearce talking about renewable energy, but more specifically, solar energy. A lot of fascinating statistics come out of this interview, and I think you'll enjoy it. But before we get to that, I'd like to remind you of my upcoming trip to South Africa, where I'll be speaking at the SARWA Conference and Educational Workshop Seminar on March the 8th. Also, I'm going to link to my article in the RWA magazine on finding a job during an industry downturn, and all of those links you can find in the show notes. Would love to hear your feedback on the article. You can reach me at globalenergyleaders@gmail.com. As I mentioned, our guest today is Dr. Joshua Pearce. He is currently an associate professor cross-appointed in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering and in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Michigan Technological University, where he runs the Open Sustainability Technological Research Group. You can find his full bio in the show notes. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Pearce. Dr. Pearce, thanks for your time today, and thanks for coming on the show. How are you doing?
Really good. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, let's get into it. I'd like to start with the state of the industry. It seems that around the mid-2000s, you start to see solar energy generation getting some traction, but I think really the last 3 to 5 years, it seems like it's taken off even more. Can you give us a high-level perspective of what's been going on in the industry?
Sure, absolutely. Things have been, I think, for the most part, exploding. If you look at sort of the worldwide PV market measured in gigawatts, we didn't break a single gigawatt, which is kind of like the equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant, until 2004. And then if you look at, say, last year, we produced 73 gigawatts, which is, for anybody that's been in the industry for a long time, it's just almost unbelievable at how rapidly it's been growing. In 2015, it shot up to 55 gigawatts. It was a 43% growth, and we've been getting these large double-digit growth year after year after year. And now it's no longer, laughable. This is a serious method to generate electricity. In the beginning part of 2016, the most new energy put on the grid in the United States was from solar. Like this, it's a major contender.
Interesting. And just to follow up on that is, I was in Zambia last year, and there was a ton of talk about solar as a viable solution for some of these poorer regions in Africa where they don't have access to coal power plants or maybe gas, natural gas, or whatever the case would be. And so it seems like it's taking off internationally in some of these more lesser developed nations as well. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And for any country or any even region, like, say, a rural area in the U.S. that doesn't have a well-developed integrated grid yet, solar is almost certainly the lowest cost option. And then the surprising thing, and this is what I think is really driving its growth globally, is that even in those places with grid power already, with access to, say, coal-powered power plants, it often makes sense economically only to just go to solar, to transition away from it. And so you're seeing more and more utilities close down coal-fired power plants. Coal companies themselves are in a lot of trouble right now. And the major reason for that is just pure economics.
With this big uptick, we should see a lot of jobs being created from the solar industry. What's the status of the job market right now?
So in the U.S., the vast majority of the jobs are related to deployment. So it's people installing solar cells, solar panels, electrical engineers designing the farms or the system, say, for a large warehouse rooftop or something like that. And so it's very job intensive. And so as of right now, there are not only more solar-related jobs than coal jobs in the U.S., which is sort of shocking for anybody familiar with our history. But even if you add up the oil and natural gas jobs and combine them, solar has more jobs. And so it's not a little player anymore. These are over 120,000 solid kind of green energy jobs, a lot of installation jobs. They're slapping up PV systems on rooftops basically as fast as they can get them there. In general, the industry, in terms of how long have you been employed in the solar industry, it's very young because it's just taking in all of these kind of new people in order to put up these new arrays that weren't even a glimmer in anyone's eyes, say 10 years ago.
Okay, so let's talk about that. There's a lot of jobs that are in the U.S. What are some of the various, you talked about, putting them on the houses and stuff, but let's just say someone, maybe a young professional or someone who could just come out of high school is listening to this, where would you recommend, okay, so let's take it two ways. A, if they want to get a job, they just want to start learning about the industry, they're young, they can be kind of fluid, where should they start then? Well, and then the follow-up to that would be is, okay, someone who says, okay, I want to be an engineering type, I'm a high-level thinker, where should they focus their degree and their study path towards?
Sure. So first, if you're a high school student and you kind of want a classical blue collar type job, that would be on the solar installation side. So either helping put up large scale solar farms for utilities, or perhaps making up a kind of a smaller multi-megawatt farm for, say, somebody like Apple or Google, or even doing the residential sector. And so for those types of jobs, it's relatively fast training. You can contact the Solar Energy Industry Association, which would give you a guide to who to contact in your particular region who does the training. And these are relatively straightforward courses. It would be sort of like preparing to get a job in construction. And so you learn about the industry, probably do an internship, do some practice runs, and then get employed. And in some of that cases, it might be accelerated because they're snapping up people so fast depending on where you are. And so that would be a kind of a good, stable, reasonably well-paying job for someone without sort of higher-level academic skills. If you're kind of on the collegiate track and going to university, in the U.S., the vast majority of the jobs right now are kind of focused around electrical engineering, where you're seeing, the grid transform into this smart grid. From in the olden days, it was sort of you had these large centralized power plants. Everything was controlled from a single location, and everybody just sucked power. Well, now you have individual consumers both producing power and using power, say, from the grid at night. The grid is getting much more complex, and so basically all the utilities need people that are kind of well-versed in solar energy. Then there's firms like Solar City, that's one of the largest employers of solar in the U.S., and they basically make it very easy for consumers to switch over. And so they provide financing, engineering, and installation, like everything comes in a box, and then the consumers you can think of it as either kind of renting your roof for a discount on your electric bill, or zero money down financing of your solar system. No matter how you look at it, you will end up saving money individually, while at the same time getting a solar cell system put up on your roof without having to finance it yourself. And so there's tons of engineers that are needed to engineer each one of those little systems, and there's thousands and thousands of those being put up. And so there's plenty of opportunity there for kind of everything from the small, like a couple kilowatt system, all the way up to the multi-hundred megawatt type system.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, and then there's other areas, like whether you're in business or like a lot of my students are material scientists that are going into developing more efficient solar cells, but also to figure out new financing schemes and working for the banks in order to finance bigger and better solar systems in the future.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going to go is, for those people who may not be, fit in either of those categories or more of the entrepreneur types, where do you see the entrepreneurs focusing their resources in the solar sector right now?
Yeah, so there's a huge opportunity. So you basically have a technology that is less expensive to produce electricity on a given average rooftop in the United States than if the consumer buys it from the grid. And so there's dozens of companies kind of operating either to provide low-cost financing or some sort of roof rental or some sort of mechanism in order to get high capital cost solar up on top of people's houses that gives them low operating costs, or basically zero operating costs. And so there's plenty of business opportunity there, dozens and dozens of businesses to get started. So all your type of kind of standard entrepreneurial business skill talent, we need a lot of it. And there's, some areas of the country, say like California, has a relatively well-developed market. But if you look at, say, like the middle of the country, particularly towards the north, you don't have as mature of a market. And so the relative costs are higher. And so if you could get someone that could get to the scale, so someone with access to capital, or say a good relationship with banks or a bank itself or a utility, all of those types of businesses are, there's low-hanging fruit to be picked. They can make a lot of profit installing solar panels.
Okay, so the job outlook seems, very, very positive. And so let's transition a little bit to, the next 20, 30 years. The EIA projects a 48% increase in world energy consumption by 2040. That's their latest report from, I think, December is when that came out. Where does solar fit in the larger picture as the energy demand continues to rise?
Well, I think it's going to become an increasingly important player. And, we're just starting to see this now in the U.S., really. I mean, even with this humongous growth in the industry, it's still a really tiny percentage of the overall electrical and certainly the overall total energy. And as we move to more electric powered vehicles, you're going to see, I think we're going to see an increase in the overall electricity use. And the vast, vast majority of that is going to come from solar. And so we'll be moving to a much smarter, much more decentralized distributed generation-based grid, and solar is going to play a major part in that. And it's going to be kind of across the board from very small systems all the way up to utility-scale systems.
Now, some might argue that the lack of sunlight and battery efficiency would be some of the drawbacks, over these next few decades that solar has to overcome. How does solar stack up to the other renewables and the non-renewables like oil and gas?
Okay, so maybe I'll talk about the pros first. So from a pro perspective, once you've paid the capital cost of a solar system, there basically is no cost, and there's no real maintenance. You just stick it up, sun shines, and you get your power. It is abundant. It's fairly well, geographically distributed. So even like I work in northern Michigan now, and we're one of the lowest solar resource places in the country, yet I haven't paid an electric bill since April with the PV system on my garage. So not any electric bill at all, because the PV has covered my bills. So we get enough sun even in these sort of more northern, not in Arizona or Florida or California. We get plenty of sun. And so if you like capitalism, where the idea is you invest capital and get a return, solar is very, very promising. Now, it does have some pretty significant drawbacks. One is it obviously doesn't produce power during the night or during extremely cloudy or snowy weather. And so because of that, to have a complete system, you need some form of backup. Historically, that's been a battery backup system that you might have for an off-grid type house. So you're in the middle of nowhere. But now that we have many more options in terms of backup. And so, the easiest case and what a standard utility would do would be have some sort of natural gas-based peaking plant in order to be able to match the load whenever it was needed, whether or not the sun was shining. But there's also other ways to do this when you're looking at it from a complete grid system. And so, for example, in general, wind and solar tend to complement each other. So when it's, bad weather and the wind is blowing, wind produces a lot of power and solar not so much. When it's nice, calm, sunny day, wind doesn't produce, but solar does. In addition, as you sort of expand the geographic area that you're looking at trying to provide power, the greater that expansion, the easier it gets. And so that's why a country like Germany has this very sophisticated grid system with all these different generating systems, a lot of hydro and wind and solar, and they all match up in order to provide their electric load with a huge percentage of renewable energy, actually fairly easily. And then you can do things like pumped storage, where you might have solar pump water during the day in order to be able to draw from hydro at night. And so using kind of a combination of all of these technologies, it's a more complicated grid. It's more difficult from an engineering perspective to put together, but it still works. And that's the direction that we're moving into. The other kind of good news is that from a batteries perspective, batteries have gotten much, much, much better in the last several years. And a large push has been sort of from the electric vehicle market. Their requirements are very stringent. The weight in particular is a major variable for them. For a PV system, we don't care about the weight. It's mostly about cost, but the costs have been plummeting. And so literally I was doing a paper on the levelized cost of electricity for these complex combined heat and power photovoltaic and battery systems. And while we were writing the paper, the cost of batteries got cut in half. So we had to change all of our estimations and everything because we didn't want the paper to be dated. So yeah, the battery technology has really been kind of coming into its own the last several years.
Well, you mentioned the lack of sunlight, and I'm curious because, even the oil and gas industry, they're constantly finding new ways to reinvent themselves. And I was just reading a book the other day about the shale revolution and how that came about. And for a long period of time, shale oil and gas wasn't really a viable solution. And so I'm curious, is overcast. Is it something that people are trying to overcome, or are we still a ways off from overcoming that obstacle?
There certainly are people working on types of solar cells that work better in overcast conditions, but in reality, that like when there is no sunlight, there's nothing really a solar cell can do for you. That said, though, coupling it to a battery system or a cogen plant makes it possible, even at the residential level, to provide all of your power. And so all of this is coming pretty quickly, and by coming, I mean the technology is already there. The economics are coming into play. And so already there's fairly good economic reasoning to consider leaving the grid. And then historically that's been kind of crazy. And now it looks like that might be one of the options. But what I think will happen instead is that we'll just have a much more integrated grid, and the utility companies will become, you can think of them more of maybe like a cable company or a internet provider instead of a kind of a standard historical electric utility.
We'll get back to our interview with Dr. Pearce, but first, let's hear from our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R2 Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R2 Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
Interesting. So if solar has these vast amount of benefits that you've discussed, what are some of the barriers that kept the industry back and keep it from kind of exploding onto the marketplace where we're hearing about it maybe a little bit more than or as much as we should?
Well, so right now in the U.S., one of the major barriers is actually kind of regulatory. We're sort of in this ecosystem where we have these markets that have been sectioned off and kind of given to utility. And the deal is they provide reliable power at a somewhat reasonable cost, and they get all of it for themselves. And so they have the entire market. They're allowed a certain return on investment for every time they purchase a power plant. And that's the way it's been going for decades. And now you have this sort of weird beast showing up where now basically all of your consumers are competing with you to produce electricity. And some electric utilities sort of get the message and know where this is heading. And so they do things like they provide the financing to put solar up on top of your roof and do power purchasing agreements with their own customers. And so they're kind of like cutting the solar cities and the sun runs out of the market because they're doing it themselves. I also just read about a utility in Vermont that's setting up power purchase agreements with their customers and helping them leave the grid. So that you still pay a monthly fee, but instead of getting your power from the grid, they provide you with a battery, PV, and like a backup generator in order to provide your needs, because it's the lowest cost solution for them to provide electricity to a particular customer. And so this kind of thinking, I think, is certainly present, but not ubiquitous. And so you have many utilities using the regulatory arms of this sort of regulated market to prevent solar from entering the grid. Good examples where I live in Michigan, it was mandated that at least 1% of the generation had to be allowed to be distributed. My utility has met its 1%, and so they've cut off all distributed generation from everybody. So you can't add more wind, solar, cogen, biomass, hydro, anything. You're not allowed. And so that is that's certainly slowing things down in those particular markets where the utilities aren't as far seen. A really good example of this is what's called plug-and-play solar. And this is where you take a module that's attached to a microinverter by a single unit. So you just have a single module that you could literally plug into the wall and provide your home or your office or apartment with a small amount of electricity. It won't cover all your loads, but it cuts down your overall use. In Europe, this is legal, and my group looked at whether or not this was technically safe in the U.S., and it is. It's possible to meet all of the necessary codes. It's no more dangerous than running a hairdryer. However, it's currently illegal in most of the U.S., and it depends on the regulations at your municipal level, at the state level, and your particular utility on whether or not people can buy these AC modules and plug them into their homes. If there was a regulation that said, in the United States, you're just allowed to do this. If you keep it under a kilowatt so that you're underneath all the safety guidelines, it would save U.S. consumers that it makes sense for economically, and they have the money to do it, $13 billion a year.
Wow.
And it would produce over $70 billion of new solar market, not anything like what we've been seeing expand. $70 billion of additional sales, and this would go to like Home Depot's and Costco's and Walmart and whoever was selling these systems. And so that one role is currently holding back $70 billion of market in the U.S., and that's just one thing.
That's fascinating because as I hear you talk about this, the perception, at least for those maybe not directly in the solar and the renewable sector in general, is the government's really pushing this, there's subsidies, there's all this stuff. And what you're saying is that, well, that may be true, but the government is hindering it just as much as it is pushing it. And is that what I'm hearing? Is that what I'm hearing?
Oh, no, absolutely. And all of the energy industry, no matter who we're talking about, everybody gets help from the government somehow.
Right.
Whether it's, tax write-offs for oil and gas exploration or whatever. Like, there's all of these loopholes and tricks, and the lobbyists have been hard at work for everybody. And I think what has happened is solar has dropped so rapidly in cost that what's holding it back isn't so much the money anymore. It's being allowed to do it, being allowed to put up solar and having access to capital in order to be able to, get the good deal. When you think about people buying, say, like a bond or a CD, we don't talk about, if that's a good idea or not. Like, if you know that you're going to get, say, a 10% return on a CD at a bank, you're going to snap that up. If you can get the same kind of return on a solar cell, we don't think of it in those terms. We're not treating them as investments as we should. We're just looking at the upfront cost. And so when you look at the upfront cost of a CD or a bond, nobody worries about like, oh, that's going to cost $5,000. It doesn't matter if it costs $5,000 if it's going to save you 10 or make you 10. And so that's really the change in mindset we need to have in order to push us kind of, over the point where we are someplace like Germany where, right now in our community, you can see solar up on a couple houses here and there, and the university has some, and there's some companies that have it, but it's not every house. It's not every rooftop that makes sense. And we have, millions and millions of rooftops to cover. And at the current rate, even though it's really fast, it's going to take decades. But every decade that goes by that you don't have it up, that's opportunity cost and money lost.
Okay, well, one final question before I let you go. In Volume 95 of Energy Policy, you talk about the idea of grid defection. Can you kind of break that down? What's going on there, and what's this all about?
Sure. So the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is this think tank in the Midwest, was looking at how some utilities are blocking distributed generation. And by distributed generation, I just mean the consumers making their own power somehow, whether wind, solar, hydro, biomass, whatever. And because the utilities have put up so many barriers, and the costs of electrical power from the grid are actually pretty high now and rising, it does make sense for people in certain markets to leave the grid now. And so that RMI study looked at, places like Hawaii, where it just, you now have the technology to leave the grid. You can put a solar system and some batteries. Should you do it? And the basic answer was yes. And my team did a similar study where we looked at one of the worst markets, and that's up here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where you don't have a lot of sunlight, particularly in the winter, and you can't get away with just a battery solar system. It's technically possible, but it would be so obscenely expensive. You'd need so many batteries, you'd fill your entire house with batteries. And so what we looked at instead was coupling a third system, a cogeneration system. And this would be a system that would run off natural gas. It would produce electricity, and then its waste heat, rather than venting it the way it does in a normal power plant, would be used to be a sort of like a preheater for your furnace. And so in some cases, you wouldn't have to run your furnace at all. The cogen would just provide all of your heat and your electricity. And you'd really only use it heavily in the winter and sometimes in the fall and spring when solar and battery couldn't take up the entire load. And so we designed the systems, simulated them, and figured out whether it made economic sense or not for consumers to actually purchase these systems. These systems are more expensive than a normal solar system because you have all these extra components. They're much more complicated to engineer. But what we found is that by 2020, over 90% of the people that come here seasonally, like just have cabins, it would make money for them to leave the grid. And 75% of the people that live here year-round would also be able to make significant money from leaving the grid. And so 2020 is not that many years off anymore.
No, it's right there.
Basically now.
Right.
And so then we went back and said, okay, let's be fair about it. Just because people can do this, do they actually have access to capital to be able to make that kind of an improvement in their home? And then the numbers drop. And so what it comes down to is about 65% of this region should leave the grid by 2020 if everything stays the way it is. What I'm hoping and what I suspect will happen is that the utilities in this region start to reach out to people to keep them on the grid by setting up power purchase agreements or doing something in order to incentivize them to stay. And that is, if that can happen here, that can happen everywhere throughout the United States. And so this is really the first time in history where this is technically possible and economic at the same time, where people, if they wanted, could be completely in charge of their own power using modern technologies.
Just fascinating stuff. And I saw someone in Australia talking about this same idea. So I don't know, maybe this mass grid defection is kind of catching a wave, if you will. It seems that people are into it.
Right. Well, there certainly is a risk. I know a lot of people like the idea of having control over their own power. And this is not like in the olden days where you had to fill the batteries up with water and all that. This is like you buy a system, plug it in, and just leave it alone. But the risk is if some people start grid defecting, it will raise the overall cost of electricity for everybody that stays on, which then encourages more people to defect. And you get this sort of death spiral. That's what the utilities call it.
Right.
Where they simply can't compete with the technologies. And that's like we're right at the cusp now where something's going to happen. And I think some utilities are ensuring their survival by literally helping your customers grid defect, but still keeping them as customers.
Right.
But if people do it on their own, then you've lost them. And kind of certainly, no matter what happens, the model that utilities used to use to provide electric power and make money is just no longer relevant, and it's becoming less relevant each day. And so they either have to change the business model or they just won't exist. And I think the smart ones certainly are going to be changing their business model.
Well, that's good to hear. And thank you so much for coming on. Before I let you go, we're going to link to the article I mentioned in Energy Policy, but what else would you like to plug or promote, or how can people get in touch with you if they have more questions?
So our group posts all of its preprints, our methods of analysis, our data sets, and everything on Appropedia. So it's appropedia.org/MOST. MOST is the Michigan Open Sustainable Technology Lab. And everything that we've talked about here, all the data, all the papers are available there.
Okay, great. And we will link to that in the show notes. Dr. Pearce, thank you so much for coming on. It was good to hear from you, and we hope to have you on in the future.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks again for Dr. Pearce coming on. Again, you can find all that information in the show notes. Now, I mentioned it before. Let's get to it. The winner of last month's giveaway was San Antonio Dog 1. So, San Antonio Dog 1, you will be receiving a copy of the book. We will get that in the mail to you. Just shoot us an email, globalenergyleaders@gmail.com, and we'll get your information and we'll get that out to you. Thank you so much for your review and everyone else's. This month, we'll be giving away a copy of The Frackers by Gregory Zuckerman. If you've worked through the Shale Revolution, I think you're really, really going to enjoy this book. I found it fascinating, being that I've worked in several of the plays that are mentioned and for several of the companies that were discussed in the book. Like last month, all you have to do is leave a written review in iTunes, and you will be entered. If you've done it already, then you know you're already in this month's drawing. Check out the show notes for everything one more time. And until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.